William Alllen, Bill Alllen, who was a long-time Bank of England man, currently a visitor at the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, and has been a special advisor to the House of Commons Treasury Committee, and is a long-standing expert on monetary matters.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to participate. It's a great pleasure to be here for the first time. Here's the plan of the talk. To begin with, I'll talk about what quantitative easing is and what the various kinds of it are, because there are several different kinds, and there's one particular kind that I'm going to talk about and reach conclusions about. Then I want to say something about the reasons for doing QE, namely to provide a monetary stimulus, to assert yield curve control, and to be a market maker of last resort. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about some of the effects of QE, for example, on the maturity structure of government debt, on public finance risk, and on the risk of fiscal dominance. Somebody referred to Sargent and Wallace this morning. That is one of the risks that I think is kind of looming. Fourthly, I'm going to talk about reversing QE, which you might call quantitative tightening, or QT. And finally, I'm going to say something about the implications for monetary policy. So I'll get on quite quickly because I've got a lot to get through. What is QE? Since the financial crisis, central banks have expanded their balance sheets. They've taken on vastly increased liabilities to commercial banks, whose reserve balances have gone up an awful lot, by buying various kinds of assets, government bonds, particularly in this country, where nearly all of the QE has been purchases of government bonds. In the United States, mortgage-backed securities as well. In the euro area, in Japan, they've also bought some privately issued securities, and in Switzerland, it's been entirely in the form of foreign securities, as Switzerland's foreign exchange reserves have gone up. All of them can be described as QE, but I intend to talk only about purchases of government bonds, and that's important because the conclusions I reach would be completely different if I were talking about purchases of different assets. So let's talk firstly about the first reason for doing QE, which is to implement an expansionary monetary policy at a time when you can't cut interest rates because you can't cut short-term interest rates because they're nearly zero already. This happened after the financial crisis, when commercial banks were effectively disabled because they couldn't get liquid assets. They needed the cash to repay depositors, and they couldn't raise cash to lend. QE was regarded as a means of offsetting the effects of the squeeze. It increased base money because the bank's reserves deposits went up. It reduced bond yields because they bought lots of bonds, and it made the exchange rate weaker. But it didn't provide a direct substitute for the credit extending function of the commercial banks in itself. Nevertheless, it was used for over the ensuing dozen years as the main instrument of monetary policy. For example, in preference to the special liquidity scheme, which was also introduced at about the same time as QE. The thing about the special liquidity scheme was that it took from the banks liquid assets that didn't count as liquid assets, and gave them in exchange treasury bills which did count as liquid assets. So it relieved the pressure that the liquidity regulations which had just been imposed put on them. So in that sense, the special liquidity scheme was more effective than QE, but it was terminated in my opinion, prematurely in 2012. Secondly, yield curve control. Now, arguably, yield curve control began in 1932 when the Fed bought government securities to stimulate the US economy or to try to revive it with some degree of success. That could be regarded as a loose form of yield curve control because there was no yield target. Rigid yield curve control was used both in Britain and in the United States during the Second World War. The arrangement there was that the government decided exactly what the yield of government securities would be at each maturity and enforced it by refusing to issue securities at any other yield or any higher yield. And what that meant was that since they were fixing the price, the quantities were determined by the market. So the maturity structure of the government debt was chosen by the market and wound up as it wound up at the end of the war. Except that after the war, yield curve control continued in both countries. It continued in this country for rather a short time because it was found to be unsustainable in early 1947. But in the United States, it went on until 1951. In both countries, it contributed to a build-up of short-term liquid assets in the economy. Real interest rates were negative, and inflation duly arrived, making real interest rates even more negative. So more recently, yield curve control has been used in Japan in an attempt to get inflation up to the target. And it hasn't succeeded, even though the amount of government securities that the Bank of Japan has bought has been enormous. In the UK, even more recently, one reason for doing QE after the coronavirus epidemic broke out in March last year, one of the reasons that was quoted was to prevent yields from rising abruptly and maintain easy monetary conditions. And that, it seems to me, is a form of loose yield curve control. There was no explicit yield target, but nevertheless, it was an objective to get yields down, not just short-term rates, but long-term rates too. What happened in March 2020 was that there was an avalanche of bond sales, government bond sales in the United States and in this country, and no doubt in other countries too, which overwhelmed the capacity of the market makers, the dealers in the market, to absorb them. And the market just stopped functioning. There were no bids. You couldn't sell gilts even if you in any circumstances. And in those circumstances, in that situation, the central banks, both in the United States and in Britain, acted as a market maker of last resort. And the way they did that was to announce QE programs where they said they would buy very large amounts of bonds, and the amounts were gradually increased. But that's not really being a market maker of last resort, because market makers buy and sell, whereas the central banks so far have bought and bought and bought and bought. And in the kind of unstated background, the subtext of this was an alternative which nobody spoke about, which was that yields might go up. But that was kind of, it was even impolite even to mention it. Now, the Bank of England itself had been a market maker in last resort in government bonds for many years, from the early 1950s up to 1986. It bought and sold, but in practice, it found it impossible, or at least it didn't manage to reconcile its market-making function with its monetary policy function. So too often it found itself pegging bond yields at levels that were too low to be sustainable, and buying increasing amounts of bonds, and inflating money supply, and then making the inflation problem worse So there were a series of kind of step upward adjustments in bond yields, and a failure to contain inflation. Now, in my opinion, central banks were right to act as a market maker of last resort in March 2020, but only so far as was needed to facilitate price adjustment. What had happened was that the volume of selling, the degree of adjustment was so great that the price discovery mechanism took a while to work. And it was the central bank's job to help it, but not to become one side of the market for a year and a half. So I don't, as it is, I think they've done 450 billion since then. I think that it would have been sufficient to do a much smaller amount over a much smaller time, and at some point to begin selling again. The mechanics of it are that firstly, the Bank of England buys bonds from investors. By way of payment, the Bank of England credits the reserve accounts of the investors' banks. So all the clearing banks get money added to their reserve accounts. And those commercial banks then credit the investors' accounts with them. So in the first stage, the monetary base goes up. And in the second stage, broad money goes up. So after QE, the supply of bonds to the market has gone down, and both the amount of the bank's reserve balances and the money supply, broad money supply, have gone up. And reserve balances are now nearly £1 trillion, or about 43% of GDP when I last looked. The bonds that the Bank of England's bought are held in a special account, which is called the APF, or Asset Purchase Facility. And this is very important. The Treasury has issued the bank with an indemnity under which it takes financial responsibility for the APF. So the APF is really part of the Treasury, although it's nominally part of the Bank of England. And although quantitative easing operations are proposed by the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee, they require the approval of the Treasury. And as far as I know, the approval, when asked for, has always been forthcoming. But it also means this, and it's very important. From the Treasury's point of view, QE means that there's been a reduction in fixed interest bond debt and an equal increase in short-term debt bearing interest at variable rates, so that from the interest rate point of view, the maturity of the government debt is shortened. Not only that, but there's a very heavy concentration at zero maturity, because all of the reserve balances of the commercial banks in the Bank of England bear interest at the current level of the Bank of England base rate. A shorter term government debt carries certain risks, which the Treasury has become aware of. One is the effect of short-term interest rate hikes. Now, suppose inflationary pressures develop in the way that Tim was describing this morning. The MPC, the Monetary Policy Committee, is mandated to pursue an inflation target, and sooner or later it will have to hike short-term interest rates. It has no choice if it's going to pursue its mandate. If and when it does that, the interest cost of the bank's reserve balances will go up immediately, because there's all this short-term, because they bear interest at the level of short-term rates mandated by the MPC. And the cost of that to the budget is 0.4% of GDP for every 1% hike. If the MPC hadn't done QE, or had already reversed it, the immediate cost would have been much less because the reserve balances would have been smaller. But that's important because it means that the Treasury has got a reason not to want the Bank of England to hike interest rates. Now, as I said, the MPC's got no choice under its current mandate but to hike rates. But it's possible, in fact, it's easy to identify circumstances in which interest rates hikes would cause budget problems for the Treasury and make the public finances unsustainable. And if you look at the Office of Budget Responsibility's Fiscal Risk Report from last July, you'll see the circumstances elaborated there. So there's obviously a risk that the Treasury in desperation might either change the mandate and inflate away the debt by having a period of negative real interest rates. Now, it's sometimes said that actually they wouldn't do that. Inflation wouldn't help the Treasury much because firstly, there's a lot of short-term debt on which interest rates would adjust quickly. And secondly, there's a lot of index-linked debt. But of course, if you had a period of negative real short-term rates, the first reason wouldn't apply. And the second reason might just mean that the government would need more inflation to achieve the same effect on the public finances. And secondly, that they would be tempted to embrace financial repression to keep interest rates down. So all that is a bit scary. Now, let me talk a bit about reversing quantitative easing. It's a bit like a cul-de-sac in the sense that you can drive up it a certain distance. When you get to the end, you have to stop and it's hard to turn around. I think they have pretty much got to the end now, or nearly, because they are in a position now where they've bought nearly half of the gilts in issue. They've got an internal rule that they don't want to hold more than 70% of any particular issue. So there's not that far to go before they kind of get to the end of the road. But once you get to the end of the cul-de-sac, it's quite hard to turn around. As I've explained, there are good reasons for thinking that you ought to turn around and go back, because QE has created a threat to the use of short-term interest rates as a monetary policy instrument, and it would be highly desirable to remove the threat. Now, the Fed began reversing QE back in 2017, and they did it simply by not reinvesting the proceeds of maturing bonds in their portfolio. And they went on for a couple of years and they had to stop. They stopped because the level of reserve balances at the Federal Reserve banks got down to a level which caused problems in the money market. And the reason why it caused problems seemed to be that the banks, the commercial banks, preferred having balances in the Fed to having Treasury securities. It's not clear whether the people who preferred holding reserve balances were the banks themselves or their regulators. But whatever the true story, it caused some disruption. And the Fed accordingly stopped reversing QE in, I think, about October 2019. Now, for the Bank of England, reversing QE simply by not reinvesting is somewhat harder because the maturity of the bonds that it holds is so long. The half-life of the Bank of England's gilt portfolio is 8 years. So if they started now, simply not reinvesting the proceeds of maturing gilts, it would take them 8 years to get rid of half of the portfolio, take a lot longer to get rid of the rest. They've actually made a statement about what their reversing, what their quantitative tightening plan is. And the 2 points are, firstly, that when the Bank of England base rate gets to 0.5%, they'll stop reinvesting. Well, it's currently 0.1%, and they've been talking for a little while about raising it. And secondly, that when the bank rate reaches 1%, that they will consider active sales. But they haven't said any more about how they'll do the active sales. So the next slide is about how you might actually go about doing QT or reversing QE. And I've talked about not reinvesting the proceeds of maturing securities. That's passive in the sense that you don't actually make a decision after the initial decision. It's simple, anybody can understand it. It's completely inflexible because the schedule is determined from now until 2071, and it's very, very slow. And that is presumably why the Bank of England has talked about active sales. What follows now is suggestions from me about how that might be done. I think it could be done in two stages. The first stage would be for the Bank of England to transfer the portfolio of gilts that it's got in the APF to the Treasury or to the DMO, and to exchange it for a new portfolio of short and medium bonds that would be attractive to commercial banks. And then secondly, once it's got the new portfolio of short to medium term bonds, to do a gigantic swap with the commercial banks, where the commercial banks pay over several hundred billion of reserve balances, and in exchange take an equivalent value of short to medium bonds. That reduces the Treasury's interest rate risk somewhat, because it means that if short-term interest rates go up, the immediate hit to the budget is less. But of course, over the 2 or 3 years, it would catch up. The second stage would be that having done the swap into short and medium bonds, you would, or at least you could, gradually lengthen the maturities by a series of exchange operations. Or even maybe just by concentrating new issues at the long end. There'll be any number of ways you could do it. But both stages would have to be carried out alongside the normal debt sales by the DMO, which have to go on anyway to finance the budget deficit and refinance maturing gilts. Now, there's one big possible problem in all this, and in debt management generally, which I think will become, or is in danger of becoming, a serious problem in the next few years, and that's lack of market liquidity. This was a big problem in the 1950s and 60s, and it's why the Bank of England became a market maker of last resort then. It hasn't been a problem, or at least not much of a problem, in the last 30 years or so since the Big Bang, which made the market much more liquid by bringing much more capital into the market-making business. But there are signs that market makers have been devoting less capital to that activity, partly because they say it isn't very profitable, and partly because of the leverage ratio, which bears hard on people who are holding large amounts of low risk assets. Now, QE has made market making much easier, because if you're bidding for gilts at an auction, you feel much more confident about doing it if you know that in a few days' time there's going to be a Bank of England reverse auction where you can sell the gilts that you bought to the Bank of England. That's quite easy. It's much harder if you know that every DMO auction is of gilts for normal deficit financing and maturity financing purposes is going to be followed by another auction undertaken for QE purposes. In other words, instead of the QE and normal funding kind of fit together neatly, QT aggravates the problems of normal funding. And moreover, it seems likely, if Tim is right, and I think he is, that yields will be rising and not falling. So the likelihood of events like that of March 2020 seem to me to be quite high. So what are the possible solutions? Well, the first solution is the one that I mentioned, which is to actually compel the banks to swap reserve balances for short and medium bonds, which is something that was done in 1951 in circumstances that weren't that different. That would mean a shift in the composition of the bank's liquid asset portfolio, but no change in its total size. And the second, which I think will be unavoidable, is to return to last resort market making on a limited scale, again as in the 70s and 80s. And in that, the market makers would have an option to sell limited amounts of gilts back to the DMO at a fixed margin below opening prices. That would be mimicking exactly what the Bank of England did from 1971 to 1986. Implications for monetary policy. Before 1986, when the gilt market was not very liquid, monetary policy and government debt management had to be coordinated. In other words, when they were making decisions about short-term interest rates, they had to worry about what was happening in the gilt market. After 1986, the gilt market was much more liquid, and that wasn't necessary anymore. The debt management could carry on by itself because the auctions were always covered. There was a clear market price that could be identified through an efficient price discovery mechanism. And debt management could be and was transferred away from the Bank of England to the DMO, which is just part of the Treasury. I think that coordination might become necessary again for the reasons that I gave, that QT is a much tougher proposition for the infrastructure of the gilt market than QE was. There will be more government bonds, diminished capacity of the market makers, and possibly rising yields. Now, a market maker of last resort can't be a price taker. That's the whole point, because the price discovery isn't working. The price discovery mechanism isn't working. And it must have a view about yields, even if it's only a very temporary view. And that, as a matter of logic, must bear some relation to the outlook for short-term interest rates. So there has to be some coordination between monetary policy and debt management. There are obvious implications for the independence of the Bank of England as regards managing inflation, and for the independence of the Treasury regarding the sustainability of the public debt. You can't have both an independent central bank and an independent Treasury if the central bank is free to use QE. And there would need to be some kind of agreement on the demarcation between the two during the process of unwinding QE. So, is quantitative easing always wicked? Not always. It's sometimes been useful. As I said, it was quite useful in 1932, and I think it was useful in 2009 as well. In the Second World War, I think that yield curve control was better than the alternative, but you have to look quite hard at the alternative. But it's got attractive short-term effects, but it's got clearly bad long-term effects, in my opinion, and it's very hard to reverse. So I think it's dangerous. Thank you.